All right, tonight we're going to be studying the Haftorah portion for Hayim Sarah, and they they share a common theme, and that is that their succession in the parsha. Abraham is looking for a new Jewish mother. He's looking for a wife for Yitzhak, and here in the Haftorah, King David is looking for a successor for him. It says here, the Haftorah starts off, King David was old and advanced in his years. It goes on to say that they covered him with garments, but he did not become warm. His servants then suggested that they seek a young virgin, so that they'd stand before the king. He could look at her. She could lie in his bosom, and that would make him warm. So they sought a beautiful girl within the boundaries of Israel, and they found Abishag, the Shumanite, and they brought her to the king. The girl was exceedingly beautiful, and she became the king's attendant, and she served him. But it's important to say that she was not intimate with her. He was not intimate with her. At that time, King David, he already had 18 wives. That was the limit. That all they could have was 18 wives. I heard a commentary say that it couldn't have been any one of those 18 wives to come lie with him to help make him warm, because he was there would be jealousy between the wives. Why her? Does she have a son that would come up, and would her son become the king? And so that's why they went with looking for this young lady. The story goes on to say, it talks about King David's oldest living son at the time. His name was Adoniah, and he was the son of Haggith. And he had exalted himself. He said, "I shall reign." He provided himself with chariots and riders and 50 men to ride before him. And in all his days, King David had never saddened him by saying, "Why have you done this?" He was never reprimanded. The text goes on to say that he was handsome. So once he proclaimed this, he discussed his intentions with some of the higher members of the I'd say the most prominent people in the realm, and once he got their approval, he said okay. He said, "Okay, let's go down." And he started doing this big ceremony at a spring called En Rogel. And he invited all of his brothers and the kings and the sons of his kings and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. But he didn't invite everybody. He just invited those that kind of fell in line or kind of agreed with him becoming king. He was the oldest living son. And now it was known, it's important to note that it was known that Solomon was supposed to succeed King David. But all his life he had never been told that he had done no wrong. "Why have you done this?" He goes, I read some commentary. This was him just acting princely, so he was just going with it. So there was a prophet, and his name was Nathan, and he heard of all this, and he went to Bathsheba, who was Solomon's mother, and he says, "Have you not heard that Adoniah, son of Haggith, has become king?" He says, "But our Lord David does not know." So then they devised this plan. He says, "So now go, I'll counsel you, and go to King David and say to him," he gives her instructions on exactly what to say. And he says, "And while you're still speaking, I'll come in after you and supplement your words." So Bathsheba, she says, "Okay." So she went to the king, into his chamber, and the text says the king was very old, and Abishag, the Shunammite woman, was serving the king. So Bathsheba bowed and prostrated herself to the king, and the king asked, "What are your concerns?" So then she goes on to say, "Have you not heard?" He said, "Have you not heard? You swore to your maidservant by Hashem, your God, only Solomon your son would reign after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now, behold, Adoniah has become king, and now, my lord the king, you did not know." He says he has slaughtered ox, fatted bull, and sheep in abundance. She goes on to tell them exactly what he's doing. She goes on to tell him that he told the commander at the commander of the army. He invited certain leaders. He told certain leaders, and they got behind him, and they're with him. But she also went on and told him that it says, "The eyes of all Israel are upon you to tell them who will sit on the throne of my Lord, the king, after him." So at that time, there's an announcement that the prophet Nathan, he entered. Just as he said, he says, I'll go in behind you and I'll supplement your words. And he comes in while she's speaking, and he starts telling, pretty much laying down the same story. What he's done, what Adoniah has done, what he's doing. He thinks he's assuming kingship, and then he adds this one thing. He says, "And behold, they are eating and drinking before him, and they have said, 'Long live King Adoniah.' But me, I your servant, Zadok the Cohen, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon did not get invited." It says, "Can this be that this matter has come before my Lord King, and you have not informed your servant who will sit on the throne of my Lord the King after him?" You know, it was he who had advised and told King David that Solomon would be his successor. So as he kind of poses this question to him, he says, "Can it possibly be?" And then finally, after hearing Bathsheba and after hearing the prophet Nathan, King David answers. He says, "Summon Bathsheba, bring her in here," and then he reaffirms his pledge that Solomon will be the king. And he says, and it's kind of an unusual thing, because he became the king while King David was still king. He says, "Look, he's going to be the king." And Bathsheba bowed down to the ground and prostrated herself to the king, and she said, "May the Lord King David live forever." And that's where our Haftorah ends. And it was really fascinating. It was to read these, for me, the first time as I'm going through all this. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to the beginning and just kind of talk about some verses that just kind of popped out. And the first thing, they covered him with garments, but he did not become warm. The commentaries say that this was a divine punishment for when he cut the garment of King Saul. So from that point forward, for his it says here, the commentary says, when he was in flight from Saul and he found the king asleep, David cut off the piece of royal garment in order to prove that he still felt the utmost reverence for the king and would not harm him, even when it would have been easy to do so. This is the reason why. I mean, he shouldn't have done that. You know, King Saul was still the king. He shouldn't have cut his garment. And some of the commentaries say that this is why he couldn't be warm. They sought a beautiful girl within the boundaries of Israel, and they found Abishag, the Shunammite woman. The first question I asked was, why? If Solomon had so many wives, and King David, he already had 18. Why did they have to go outside. But as we discussed earlier, you know, because because of the jealousy, they couldn't ask one of the 18 wives to come lie with them, and that text really popped out at me. Yes.
You mentioned that King David was only allowed 18 wives,
Mm-hmm.
like only.
Right.
Solomon had 1,000.
1,000. Yeah. Obviously, the same rules didn't apply.
Did he change the decree or?
I didn't find. I couldn't see why. I don't know if the decree or blessing was different for him, but we all know that it was different. Yeah. But it's good when I should have looked that up. But you know, everything that I had found and the person. Oh yeah, the person that I was a person that I was listening to said it just didn't apply to King Solomon. You know, but I'm sure there's a reason. Said all the next verse is in verse 6. It said all his days his father had never saddened him by saying, why have you done this? The Radak says because his father had never reprimanded him for anything, he believed that David loved him more than any of his brothers and would not protest this public declaration that he would be the next king. Rashi goes on to say that ultimately, however, David's tolerance led to Adoniah's downfall. This verse teaches us that he who refrains from disciplining his child ultimately leads him to his death. That one was a hard one for me to hear because I don't know. I often say that I should have been disciplined more, you know, in my earlier years, and I don't know why. But there's also another commentary, and I'd like to go into it. They took my parents took the approach of being patient and giving me my space, but yeah. So, but like I mentioned, I wanted to go into Rav Palms on the Haftorah, and he said he was often asked. He was asked how would he deal with like a rebellious child. And he said he observed two ways to deal with a rebellious child. And one of them was that in one situation that he noticed is the parents lost their patience and could no longer deal with their son's rebellious and outright flaunting of Torah mitzvot. They threw him out of the house. The boy felt, and it goes on to say that the boy felt that since his parents had disowned him, he could do whatever he wanted. He cut off all his ties with his family, and until this day remains irreligious. He also goes on to say that he talked about another family's reaction, and this family, although what they were going through was terribly difficult, they dealt with it with patience. They dealt with it. I love this. I love this right here. It says they dealt with it as one would deal with a child's passing illness. When a child is sick, parents must feel the pain and do whatever possible to heal him, while of course davening to Hashem and hoping for the best. So too did they react to this spiritual illness. They dealt with it spiritually. You know, and I never really looked at it like that. But yeah, I thought that was dealing with it as one would treat a child's passing illness. So that was really beautiful. There's another in verses 12 and 13. It says, "So now go, I will give you counsel now, so that you may serve your soul and the soul of your son Solomon. Go and come to the king and say to him." This was during the prophet Nathan's plan when he was instructing Bathsheba on what to do. It's so important that he said to go. I mean, I can remember it takes action. You have to do something. You could sit there and stand back and watch and see how all this plays out, but it takes action. Yes, it was divine that Solomon was going to become king, but it takes action. You have to do something. You have to. You can't just hang around. First thing I thought of is I can remember asking Hashem that I wanted to share. I wanted to teach. I wanted to learn. I wanted to retain. I wanted to share. And it was something that I had never was comfortable doing. But it only if I would have just kept sitting at the house and just saying, oh, I want to share, I want to tell them I want to share, I want to learn, I want to teach, without me doing anything, then how could I have possibly done it? It took action on my part to actually do it. So I mean, he tells her twice, so now go, and then in verse 12, and then in verse 13, go and come to the king and say to him. So that one really popped out at me. So then it's in verse 15 it says, so Bathsheba came to the king into the chamber. The king was very old, and Abishag the Shunammite was serving the king. Bathsheba bowed and prostrated herself to the king, and the king said, what concerns you? I was reading the commentary on this, and I thought it was, so she bowed. It says, it made mention, it pointed out that she bowed. And I was like, well, would a wife normally bow when she would come into the room? Commentaries say that it would if she had a question. You know, it's not like she's coming in and saying, how are you, checking on him, but she bowed, and King David recognized that, and the very first thing he says is, what concerns you? You know, and I thought that was just beautiful. And then I just started falling in love with the text, and I was like, oh, just keep reading. But it was really awesome. So,
I mean, even if you were his wife, you had to give him his respect, just like Esther.
mm-hmm.
You know, she couldn't speak with. I mean, she faced death if she, spoke
Yep.
without being summoned.
Yep. So yeah, I thought that was beautiful that came out in the commentary. So,
You mentioned both patience and action. I guess you would have to go by case by case.
yes, you can't really base all of the possibilities. You're talking about with your children.
With children, yes.
Yeah.
I know there's another verse that says, "Spare the rod for the child."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you couldn't base it on all of the instances, but based on one where you just outright, show them disgust and your disappointment, and you throw them out, versus being patient. During those two cases, patience won out. Patience, the child came back to found Torah again, started observing the mitzvot, and found himself again. So yes,
The rod can also be discipline.
yes,
Discipline can take a lot of forms.
it sure can.
Yeah, you stand up to them and you put the rules down and stuff. I mean, that's discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's for sure. Takes a lot of work. Yes.
I wonder if back in verse 6 where it says he never really disciplined his son. And it makes the statement, he was very handsome, and he was born after Absalom.
Mm-hmm.
Absalom led a revolt.
Let it
Tried
revolt.
to overthrow, and he ended up being killed.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if then David went to the other extreme with the son that came after him, thinking, well, if I, do this, then, so,
Very good
because
point.
there's got to be a reason why it mentioned he was born after.
He was born after him. The commentary I read is that he was handsome just like he was, and although he had led that revolt, and yeah, that's a very good point. You know, he took patience with.
He really wasn't hurting anything.
Mhm.
David knew who was going to be king.
Hmm.
Why bring that turmoil into your life? You really don't have to. He had already had one son
Hmm.
fighting for.
Right. Yeah.
Another thing, beauty and being handsome, it also has a connotation of being righteous and being having Torah and knowing Torah and keeping Sunday. So
Yes.
Kabbalah always speaks about that when it talks about the beauty of a woman,
Hmm.
and she's a righteous woman, and she's has Torah. And I would assume it's the same thing for men, a handsome man,
Right.
with knowledge of Hashem and knowing the deep secrets of Hashem.
Yes. That's beautiful. Thank you. But yeah, we could see that he took the more patient route. You know, like I said, I had read a commentary that King David acted with patience because he was only doing. He was acting very princely. He was the oldest living son. He would be normally he would be the next in line. Although it was known that Solomon was going to become the next king, but it was right on that days. He was late in his years. He was tired. He was on his last days. He was, you know, normally somebody who was 70 years old at that time wouldn't have been so frail, but they say he brought all of his years, all of his 40 years as all of his years as king, all the battles, everything that he did. He lived every day for what it was worth. He was a warrior, and he brought it all into his old age. And
And again, wasn't it Hashem that told him that Solomon was building the temple?
Mhm.
So he really didn't select Solomon to come.
right, exactly.
David designed it.
Solomon built it. Yep. Yes.
We see the wisdom in Nathan too, and where he goes to Bathsheba and he says, you know, goes to save your life and the life of your son Solomon.
Hmm.
In those days, if Adonijah had become king, the custom was they killed everybody that might be a threat.
Exactly.
So it wasn't just save Solomon to be king; it was to actually save their lives.
It was to save their lives.
Them and Bathsheba and anybody that might have been a threat.
It was to save their lives because it was there was some commentary that says that there may have been, let me find it here, that there may have been something to say about how Bathsheba and King David became married and had their child, and because of how under the circumstances, and so that's why it was so important for Nathan to go in there and say, look, this is what you've got to do. You've got to get the king to acknowledge what's going on, and to kind of lay out the plan, lay it all out. But yeah, he definitely very wise to what was going on. In the it says in verse 14, while you are still speaking with the king, I will come after you and supplement your words. He does put in one other thing after he's telling the king about what's going on. He says, and behold, they are eating and drinking, and they have said, long live King Adoniah. Now, whether Bathsheba know that's what was said, whether she did or he didn't, you know, the commentaries say that this is what he was talking about. It's a possibility that says, I will come in and supplement your words. I will come in and kind of just add that one more detail, you know, to stress the urgency on what's going on.
Kind of like a witness too, like she's not making it up.
Exactly. Exactly.
But they do set up.
Right. In verse 27, it states, "Can it?" This is Nathan. He's saying, "Can it be that this matter has come from my lord the king, and you have not informed your servant who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him?" It was because it was he who told him. It was he who let him know. I believe that was in Ecclesiastes. I found that one here. No, I had it here. I'm sorry. In First Chronicles 22:9, it was he had told him. So So yeah, and it says here in the final verse of the Haftorah, it says, Bathsheba bowed down to the ground and prostrated herself to the king, and she said, "May the Lord King David live forever." Now he was he was all in his last days here, right? So I mean, what does he mean by that? What did she mean by that? It says here that God had promised David not only that his dynasty would never be removed, but also that it would be perpetuated through the descendants of Solomon. Now that David had reaffirmed that his successor would indeed be Solomon, Bathsheba responded that now King David would live forever through the dynasty that would flow through Solomon's offspring, and that is from Rabbi Soloveitchik. So yeah, it was.
There's also a prophecy in Amos that in the last days that Hashem would raise tabernacle.
Oh really? Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, look that up in Amos. You said.
And we pray that in the Amidah.
Mm-hmm.
One of the last things.
Wow.
That could help explain the 1,000 wives too. That's a lot of offspring, and so you've got a large pool from who.
A lot of wives.
It also has connotations to the Mashiach. When you think about it, the Mashiach is the line of King David.
Mhm.
And the Mashiach is going to come and reign.
Yeah.
It's interesting how King David was choosing a new king, and Isaac was choosing a wife for his, well, not Isaac, but
Yeah.
both
So.
of the beginnings of it.
Yep. Well, that's the Haftorah portion for this week, and I'm really looking forward to the weeks to come, because it was really wonderful getting into it. And there's so much meaning in everything in this. You know, there's so much meaning in it. So thank you.